Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason Gourmet with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Pleasure to welcome you to this extremely timely discussion about the 50-50 Senate that will begin to lead our nation just in a couple of days. As everyone knows, this is one of the most disruptive and disorienting weeks in our democracy in a long, long while. Yet there is an absolute urgency to govern, and the national capacity to recover and heal and flourish will run through the United States Senate. We are incredibly fortunate to have with us two dear friends of the BPC, Senators Tom Daschle and Trent Lott, who I think most folks know had the tremendous challenge of leading the last divided Senate. I will say that they were not our first choice, but Chester Arthur and George Pendleton, the son-in-law of Francis Scott Key, were not available. And that really was the last time, about 140 years ago, that we had this experience. So we are going to be working with our dear friends Trent and Tom today. What I want to try to do is three things. And I was teasing Trent that we've done this together before. And I know that sometimes I get out one question and like 35 minutes later, I thank them very much for their leadership. But I'm gonna try to lead us through kind of three topics. First, just talk a little bit about the mechanics of what it means to have a 50-50 Senate, because the fundamental premise of the rules is designed for a majority and a minority. And I think that's obviously very much on the country's mind. I think the second question is the ramifications of this 20 years ago, somewhat different than today, and trying to understand what the relevance is of Tom, your and Trent's experience in 2001 to what Senators Schumer and McConnell and Vice President-elect Harris are going to be facing. And then finally, want to talk about policy. There are some really important mechanisms, filibuster, reconciliation, that are going to determine a lot of how the Congress functions, and then really eager for your both kind of experienced sense on what are the issues that this divided Congress and President Biden administration can get done together. So that's the ambition. Before going right into the 50-50 Senate, we just had an all-staff conversation about the violence of last week and what it means for the country and our organization. And we came out with a tremendous number of good questions, not a lot of clear answers. And I wanted to just maybe ask you, Tom, first, is this an inflection point where the need for, commitment to national service and patriotism will start to push against the, convenience and opportunism of, party politics? Or is this a new low that will set a precedent that we will continue to suffer from? How do you see this informing the next couple of years of our political process?
Well, Jason, first of all, thank you for hosting this event. And let me just say what a real pleasure it is for me to have the opportunity to join Trent once again as we talk about these important questions. I think it's probably too early to know just what kind of historical impact this will have on our country and on the Congress. I can't help but relate back to 9/11 in many regards. The fact that we had a tragedy of a magnitude like 9/11, and that we're comparing it to the desecration of the Capitol, says all you need to know about the historical nature and the tragedy involved with both incidents. I'm also pleased that just as Trent and I, as part of leadership, came back and started working in our democratic republic the very following day after 9/11, I really have to applaud the leadership of both the House and the Senate in coming back into that building, our beloved Capitol, hours after this desecration occurred, to resume the business of governance. So I think there are some parallels. The real question is, how united will this country be going forward? We had the good fortune of being quite united right after 9/11. I don't see that same degree of unity now, and I'm troubled by that. I hope we can bring this country together, and I think that'll be Joe Biden's big responsibility and opportunity, frankly, to address the need for cohesion and unity and find an agenda that allows us to work through the many challenges involved in doing so. There's so much work to be done, but that will be a very big question. In the meantime, we also have to be concerned about security. We've seen the resignation of the sergeants of arms and the chief of police, but it's going to take more than just a change in leadership in security to address the many organizational challenges we face as we look to security going forward. That's another parallel with 9/11. So a lot on the table, and we probably won't know how it all shakes out for at least a couple of years.
Thank you, Tom. Senator Lott, let me ask you to reflect a little bit on what the dynamics look like in the Republican Party. It is an understatement to say that the party you led 20 years ago is different than the party that President Trump has led for the last 4 years. I think those differences were starkly on display in the last few weeks. How do you see the Republican Party metabolizing what just happened and kind of understanding what it is and what it stands for going forwards?
Well, first, Jason, thank you very much for doing this and giving Tom and me an opportunity to talk about how we worked together back in 2001. And I want to say how much I appreciate the job that the Bipartisan Policy Center does. Your membership, their participation, we need it now, perhaps more than ever. We need some bipartisanship or some nonpartisanship. Secondly, when you ask the question about what do you think about the 50-50 Senate where we are? Well, obviously, a 50-50 or equally divided Senate is always a challenge, a big one. It's not easy to deal with. Some people say, oh, well, it was so easy when you and Tom were there. You didn't have as much social media. You didn't have some of the acrimonies going on. But Tom and I dealt with a lot of tough things. We had to deal with 9/11, which this past week reminded me of that week. What a horrible experience that was. Tom and I wound up flying in a helicopter where we could see the burning Pentagon off to our left or to our south as we flew to an undisclosed location for the balance of the day until we finally said, no, we're going back to the Capitol. We're going back to work. And I agree with Tom. I commend the leadership in the House and the Senate for going back into session and ratifying the Electoral College results. That was courageous. That wasn't easy based on what had happened that day. I just hope that this is not the day that the music stopped. Our great republic needs to work together to get some things done. The Republican Party obviously is going to have to go through self-evaluation. How in the world did we lose those 2 seats in Georgia? And how do we deal with the aftermath of President Trump? And who will be our leaders? Who will step up? And as Tom and I have said in our book, Crisis Point, one of the things we need so much right now is better chemistry and better communication. President-elect Joe Biden, he's a creature of the Senate. Will he use that to the advantage of his advantage or the advantage of the country? Will he call not only Chuck Schumer, but also talk to Mitch McConnell, talk to the leaders, listen to them? One of the things I loved about Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, Ronald Reagan had a leadership meeting, usually bipartisan, every Tuesday. The Congress was in session in the White House, and he listened. Sometimes we wondered if he was hearing, but he listened, and it helped get things done. And after 9/11, George W. Bush met with Tom and me and Denny Hastert and Gephardt, the House leaders, to talk about where we were and what was happening around the world and what we needed to do. So, the Republicans have a challenge, and so does our country. I don't know. I was just sick last week. I have to tell you, I've worked in and around that Capitol building for 39 years as a staff member, a congressman, a senator, in the leadership. I worked on trying to beef up the security of the Capitol. Well, obviously, the security did not work last week. So we've got to do a real evaluation of where we are with the security, how we're going to work with a new president, and how is a 50-50 Senate going to work. But I want to say this one final thing, and I'll yield the floor. I know beginning to sound like a senator filibustering, but the time that we worked together in 2001 in the aftermath, having a leader like Tom Daschle that I could talk to in confidence and with respect and with trust is what made the difference.
Thank you. So you both invoked the analogy to 9/11, and one thing that has occurred to us is whether the kind of vision of the 9/11 Commission, which was evidence-based, trying to get to root causes of issues and studiously bipartisan, is actually an appropriate idea going forward. We've actually reached out to Lee Hamilton and Tom Kaine, who I think you both know we've worked with over the years, to see if that's something that resonates with them. So we can maybe get you all back together after we talk about the 50-50 Senate to talk about what that looks like going forwards. But to jump in to your history together, and Trent just alluded to your fondness. It was tough sledding, right? Like we had the two of you on, we've done probably 30 events. Someone actually came up to me after one of the old events and said, they're like an old married couple. Like, didn't they used to hate each other? So take us back a little. What was it like as you entered this discussion, the same discussion now that, Senators Schumer and McConnell have to have, and started to put together a power sharing agreement? And, Tom, what were those key elements that allowed it to function?
I think the key element was the recognition that we needed an organizing resolution that really required a lot of imagination. We'd never seen a 50-50 Senate before. We'd seen other times when the Senate was tied, but never at 50-50. That was the first in all of history. And part of it, I think, was a realization that, we had to tell our members things that they didn't want to hear. We had to make concessions that they weren't happy with. And I have to say, and Jason, you've heard me say this before, but Trent gets the Courage of the Year award for that whole experience. He showed enormous courage and remarkable leadership in getting that job done. We both had controversial times in our caucuses, and there were times when we really weren't sure how it was all going to play out. But it was leadership and courage and the real strength that Trent so personified that I think was the secret to our success. But there was another factor, and that was inclusion. What we did was we'd have meetings in the old Senate chamber to bring in our caucus and talk through some of these issues. There was one in particular that we'll never forget. We even had a prayer by Senator Byrd, and we had Danny Akaka reflect on the history, and we had discussions, and it took Phil Gramm and Ted Kennedy, of all people, to offer some ideas that we jumped on, and without really even knowing all the details of those ideas, and reached what we thought was a tentative agreement. But inclusion made a big difference. And it took us, even with all of that, it took us over 3 weeks to get done. But it was one of the most difficult things I did in the 10 years I was leader.
So Trent, you were, at least for a little while there, the leader. And so you had a lot of anticipation from your party that, you had the vice president's vote on your side, yet you decided to share resources, 50-50 in terms of in terms of staff, in terms of committee. Now, obviously, you held on to the prerogative to try to set the floor agenda, but what was important that worked then, and what would you recommend Senator Schumer think about going forward?
Right. Well, I had been majority leader for 6.5 years, so this was a little bit of a shock, like it is right now, I'm sure, to Mitch McConnell, and maybe even to Chuck Schumer, when he realizes, oh, okay, now this leadership role is in my lap. But it was not easy. And I think in our book that Tom and I wrote together, Crisis Point, that I mentioned earlier, we pretty much acknowledge my conference felt like I'd given too much, and Tom Daschle's conference felt like he should have made a deal at all. So there was resistance. And when I presented it, what we'd come up with, which was basically, hey, look, it's 50-50. Let's be honest about it. Let's make it 50-50. We'll have equal numbers on committees. We'll share the money. We'll have equal opportunity for capital offices. There will be a process to take legislation to the floor of the Senate if there's a tie. So we worked through all of that. But the bottom line was, look, it was tied. And I felt like the best thing to do for our country to be able to get things done was to be honest and be fair about it. But when I took it to the Republican conference, some of my best friends said, we don't like this. We're in the majority. We have the vice president. Why did you reach this agreement? Finally, a good friend, old curmudgeon senator from Kansas, Pat Roberts, stood up and said, what are you talking about? It's 50-50. The leader's done the best job he could. He's trying to be fair about it. Now we need to get to work. And that was the primary concern in my mind. The last time there was an equally divided Senate, it took them like 5 months, and it was blood all over the place. Well, it wasn't easy for us, but we got it done. And then we did do a tax cut bill, maybe not as high as some of us would have liked, but we got it done. We passed the appropriations bills. We passed the defense bill. We passed even No Child Left Behind, with work between Ted Kennedy and John Boehner. So in the next 5 months, we got a lot done. And that's what I would urge now, the leadership is really on Chuck Schumer's foot right now. Is he going to reach out to McConnell? Is McConnell going to be responsive? Are they going to be willing to sit down and, for the good of the Senate and the good of the country, work out an agreement about how to go forward? I bet President-elect Biden would like to see that happen. It would certainly make it easier for him to get an agenda. And there's a lot that needs to be done, can be done. There's more that can be done, needs to be done on the pandemic. They can do infrastructure. There's some things they can do together. So they need to set the table with a fair agreement and then go forward.
So, I alluded to this earlier, but there's a tendency of everyone to say, well, that was then, this is now. That nothing about today is actually resonant with what Tom and Trent were handling 20 years ago. And you mentioned your book, Crisis Point. I want to read you a sentence from chapter 7, which was called the 50-50 Senate. It reads, with a disputed election and Clinton's impeachment ordeal still fresh in everyone's mind, we just couldn't afford another constitutional crisis on our hands. There's no way the American people would stomach it. So the boundary conditions of 2000 and now are not, frankly, that different. But I ask you, Tom, do you think Senator Schumer can basically, follow what Trent was able to do and offer a similarly kind of, equal division of resources, seats? Is that the line that you would expect he would follow?
I would hope so, Jason. I think the majority has the lion's share of the responsibility to set the tone, and Trent did that in 2001. He was going to be in the majority with the elevation of Dick Cheney as our president of the Senate, and so they were in the majority, and the majority has a lot of responsibility, a lot of power, a lot of the prerogatives, and so it's really more on the majority leader's side. But I think both minority and majority leaders have roles to play that are absolutely essential. But at the end of the day, it's the majority leader who kind of creates the tone. And that's why it took so much courage for Trent to make the decisions he did and why he did it in such a profoundly successful way. I'm hopeful that Democrats can demonstrate that same degree of courage and that same degree of comity as we work through these very challenging issues this time. You're right. The circumstances in many cases are different. They have social media now, and they have, as Trent noted, and they have cable news and all of that. But it really doesn't change the circumstances within the institution itself. Those are the same. And the historical lay of the land, as we see it today, is remarkably similar in many respects to what it was 20 years ago.
So, something that is pretty core to the ethos of the Bipartisan Policy Center is the idea that relationships actually matter. And I teach you about this a little bit early on. But you two were not the best of friends. I mean, you weren't by any means political enemies, but you were not the best of friends when this moment was thrust upon the two of you. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about, what you did. I love the story about the fact that you had a phone on each other's desks that went right to each other. And I think the people who that freaked out the most were your staff, who couldn't tolerate talking to each other directly. But, the situation between Senators McConnell and Schumer. What would you argue that they should do to create the kind of possibility of collaboration that you and Tom had?
You mentioned that phone. It was a red phone. And I say somewhat jokingly, when I picked it up, it didn't ring at the Kremlin. It rang only on Tom Daschle's desk. And yes, we did use it to get around the media. If I got out of my office and went around the hall to Tom's office, the media was there. They knew something was up. And also, sometimes we did it to get around our own staffs who might not like the deal we were working on. There are so many similarities. We had been through the impeachment trial of William Jefferson Clinton. And I think that's when Tom and I, we didn't know each other that well, but over a period of time, we worked together. We talked a lot. I'm going to do something most politicians don't like to do, is give credit to somebody else's quote. But one of my favorite quotes from Tom Daschle is that the most important leadership tool is your ears. If you're listening, you might be learning something. But, we did evolve into a trusting relationship. And I think the impeachment trial of William Jefferson Clinton actually brought us together. That was a tough slide, but I was determined we were going to get through it in a reasonable period of time, in a fair way, And when it was over, because I knew we weren't going to get the votes to remove him, we could go back to work. And we did finish up on a Friday, and stepped into the center aisle and shook hands with Tom Daschle and said, we did it. And the following week, I got a call on Thursday from President Bill Clinton wanting to talk about a bill he was interested in. He never mentioned the impeachment trial or what had happened. So now they've been through a recent impeachment proceeding. Not a very pretty situation at all. I'm not sure that situation wound up being as positive an influence on the relationships as the one with Clinton did between Tom and me. But, you know, we need leadership so badly now, and we need people to communicate and talk about. The country really needs help right now. We still have a pandemic. I would like for Senator Schumer and Senator McConnell think about, okay, how can this new president go forward, hopefully in a bipartisan way, and do what's needed to help with the pandemic and the aftermath economically and infrastructure bill. There are some things they can do, but it's going to take courage on the two leaders' part.
So I want to start to move into that question of the policy agenda. I should note that in about 10 minutes, we're going to open it up to questions. We've already had a significant number of them enter into the chat where you all should not only ask questions, but you can also find the Chapter 7 excerpt of Tom and Trent's book, which is in the chat line, and we've cleared the copyright, so you all can read that for free. If you want the rest of the book, of course, you'll have to talk to Amazon. But to kind of lean now into the real issue before the country, we have a profound public health crisis, a desperate economic situation. This is not time, as you said, for Congress to spend 3 or 4 months, dickering about how to, organize itself. So, Tom, would you talk a little bit before about policy, about the mechanisms? I think there was some question, had there been a blue wave that the Democratic Party was going to try to do away with the legislative filibuster? Interested to know whether you think there's any possibility of that. And then probably more specifically, reconciliation. The process that allows on budgetary issues to move forward with only 50 votes seems certain to be invoked. It was critical in the Affordable Care Act and the Republican tax legislation. But if you could reflect a little bit on filibuster, and how do you hope and see reconciliation being used, in the first 6 to 9 months?
Well, Jason, first of all, I would hope that they would do everything they could to try to create an environment where there is chemistry, but not only between the leaders, but between the caucuses. If I were Joe Biden, I'd invite everybody down, just what Trent was saying earlier, take the cue from President Reagan and President Bush. It really worked to have the president invite the leadership down once a week. If nothing else, then to create the chemistry. I probably use that word too often, but I just think you can't emphasize enough how critical it is to have good chemistry. But that chemistry is important to filter down through the caucuses as well. How about a joint caucus every other week to talk a little bit about what they could do together for that period of time? What about reopening the little dining room, the private dining room where you had 2 tables and everybody sat around family style and got to know one another a little bit more? What about inviting the leaders up to Camp David to talk about the agenda and figure out what they could do over the course of the first 100 days? All of those things involve chemistry and involve inclusion and involve trying to create a better environment so that you don't have to use all of these imaginative legislative techniques to get around the rules to get something done. I think there's a potential for 60 votes on infrastructure. There's a potential for 60 plus votes on restoring the economic economy and the economic revitalization that this country so badly needs. There's probably 60 votes if we do COVID right again. I mean, there's just a lot of things you could do that I think could potentially bring a lot of votes together. And I would want to see the leadership and the president try those options, recognizing that compromise is not capitulation. Compromise is the oxygen of democracy. And there's opportunity for compromise here that I think just lends itself to all those efforts.
So if I can just be precise about that, it sounds like you're saying, and I know that I would not ask you to advise successors, that it's your hope that they would move through a regular order process as long as they could before moving towards the 50 vote threshold. Is that a fair summary?
Well, first of all, it's not a given that he's got 50 votes on anything. I mean, you're going to have differences within the caucus as well on all kinds of issues. So, you don't assume that, but I think you just have to, I'd like them to think going in, that it is possible to get 2/3 or 3/4 of the body to work on issues together and really accomplish a number of things. I can't tell you, how dramatically that would improve the perception of Congress if they weren't so dysfunctional. They were actually getting things done, especially rapidly after this chaos and tragedy. If you saw a number of things happen that enjoyed broad bipartisan support, I think that'd be the kind of interjection of enthusiasm and excitement in the country that we haven't seen in a long time.
Jason, quite often when one party has the White House, the House, and the Senate, whether it's Republican or Democrat, there's a tendency to overplay your hand. For something to really continue to exist and survive and do well, you really need it to be bipartisan, something you worked out that really wasn't all that pretty. But also, there is this budget process called reconciliation. You actually can have some provisions, and I used it to get things through by only 50 votes. But I think that Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell really need to try to provide some direction and leadership to get some things done here in the first 100 days. I mean, President Biden-elect has talked about how he wants to do so many things in the first 100 days. He's probably not going to be able to do them all, but some of them need to be done, and they've got to find a way to make it happen.
So let me follow up, Trent, on the question about that kind of getting out of the box, right? I think while some say it was exaggerated, Senator McConnell's assertion that he wanted to have President Obama be a one-term president became kind of notorious for the expression of opposition to the new president's agenda. I will just admit that it's my hope and surmise that two things may change that, right? The 50-50 Senate, as you say, makes it clear that nobody can proclaim a mandate with 1 or 2 seat majority. But does the crisis force the agenda tighter in a way that's going to be more appealing to Republicans to collaborate? Is the fact that it's going to be economic policy, healthcare, dealing with unemployment, do you feel like that is going to put more of an obligation on Senate Republicans, as the CARES Act kind of revealed, to be part of those collaborative solutions?
I think they're going to have to learn to work with the Democrats and the new president to get some things done. And I do think that it's important that the Democrats don't, they say now they want to go big, they want to go bold. And I understand, but also they need to think about, okay, how can we actually get things done in a way that's good for the country? And I don't know, I'm nervous about, will it happen? But I really wonder, and I hope, and I pray that the events of last week were a wake-up call for a lot of people, whether you were for or against Trump or for or against, the Democrats. A lot of people this week ought to be saying, hey, this is not good. We have got to find a way to bring the country back together. I mean, my grandchildren are even asking me about what happens next. Can it go any lower? I keep, for the last year, I've been saying, I can't get any worse. I'll be damned, it gets worse every month on a variety of fronts. So perhaps what we saw, what we've experienced in the last month with the elections and the pandemic and, the events of last week at the Capitol will be a sobering event. It will change the tenor of the debate. It would help if the media would help us with that. But, they've got an agenda too. But yeah, there's a tremendous responsibility now rests in the hands of President-elect Biden and the senators and the House leaders too, Speaker Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy. They need to all cool it a little bit, talk to each other a little more.
So I'm going to turn to the questions, but I have one last one for Tom. And I put Trent on the spot, asking him what he thought was the capacity of the Republican Party to bridge itself back together. You know, the main debate right now in the Democratic Party is, do they move forward with some kind of impeachment over the next few days? And I think it's again kind of reveals this question of how much do we address this crisis of the moment, and to what extent does that enable or disable an agenda going forward? Do you have any advice? How would you think about that choice over the next week?
Well, I think the desire, Jason, is to not ignore the need to hold the president accountable for his actions. And that's what they're doing with this impeachment resolution. My own view is that it's a mistake, and that, first of all, it is further divisive, and I think it'll galvanize President Trump's supporters. I think I would be supportive of a censure resolution, in part because it's definitive, it's final. It doesn't send the whole matter to the Senate and require another trial. I think Chuck Schumer and for that matter, Chuck and Rich are going to be in a very difficult position on what to do if that article comes over. We're going to have to decide, when do we schedule a trial? Do you do it in the first 100 days and destroy whatever opportunity there is to accomplish what we've just been talking about? Do you delay it and then let it hang over the Senate for a long period of time and let it become even more controversial? So I think an impeachment mechanism is just not the right course at all. If they want to hold the president accountable, we've used a censure resolution in the past in cases involving the president, and I think that's the most appropriate approach to use in this case.
Yeah, and Tom will remember this. We almost did that with Bill Clinton, and in retrospect, maybe that's what we should have done instead of going forcing the vote on the actual removal. But as we have been talking, I just saw news in the Washington Post. Biden hopes the Senate could hold up Trump's impeachment trial while working on the new agenda.
It's good to
That
know
might make a difference.
you're always multitasking, Senator. So I have a handful of questions. I'm going to just try to pick 3 or 4 from, and I'll be looking to my left, from Doyle McManus, columnist of the LA Times. Question basically is, referring back to Senator Schumer, what's in it, Tom, for Senator Schumer to want a deal? Why isn't it actually in his interest just to start to take advantage of the moment? You get that premise of 100 days to run the table. Why shouldn't he take advantage of that opportunity?
Well, I think the short answer is because it will magnify the many problems and challenges he'll have. The one thing that we both, Trent and I, look back with some satisfaction around in that period after 9/11 and in that 50-50 Senate was that we got so much done. There is no guarantee that Chuck Schumer can get anything done if he doesn't get the cooperation of Mitch McConnell. Chuck Schumer himself was able to hold back things that Mitch McConnell wanted to do. And so he knows what the minority leader is capable of doing. Well, Mitch McConnell knows the Senate as well or better than anybody sitting today. And he'll use every rule, every tool he has available to him if he doesn't have any reason to cooperate. So give Mitch McConnell reasons to be a partner, reasons to be cooperative and collaborative. You do that, and I guarantee you're going to accomplish twice, 3, 4 times as much as you will otherwise.
So Trent, the question to you, it is unnamed, but I think it's a very good one, and it is essentially, I'll summarize. The two of you said in the past, this is someone obviously familiar with the BPC, that you don't think it's appropriate to do away with the filibuster, but it's been badly abused. And are there ways in which you think that would not be quite as polarizing, the Senate could actually improve upon, or in some way, limit the use of the filibuster without doing away with it altogether?
I think the Senate has been slipping and sliding downhill, less and less cooperation, going back probably to 2002. During Republican and Democrat administrations, they've been losing ground, and there's plenty of blame to go around. But, it's, I guess, an outmoded comment, but they ought to return to regular order. Committees need to do their work. Senators should be able to offer amendments in committee and on the floor. They have just shut down the true legislative process. I can't remember the last time they had a legitimate conference between the House and the Senate to work out the details. I used to tell some of my Republican senators, okay, come on, go along with this amendment. we'll work it out in conference. And quite often they would, and we did. So, you know, that really important. One of the important things about the agreement that Tom and I worked out was that if there was a tie vote in the committee, either one of us could take it to the floor. I mean, ordinarily the minority leader doesn't get to take a bill to the floor. And of course, if there was a tie vote on the floor, the vice president, Dick Cheney in that case, and Kamala Harris would be able to do that now. So that's one of the things I really think, other than chemistry and communication and listening to each other, the most important thing they could do is to go back to regular order, let people really legislate. And by the way, talking about the two leaders now, Mitch McConnell is a world champ defensive player. He's proven that. But we need a little offense. Can we do something positive for America? We need it in so many ways. These two guys have got to find a way to work together.
I could just add one other thing, Jason, that I think could go a long way. And we've talked about this in the past, but I do think that in a constructive and clear way, we've got to bring back earmarks to give people an opportunity to feel invested in legislation. Right now, there's no investment in the legislation. Oftentimes, people pass or oppose things, and they just don't feel connected to it. But once they have skin in the game and a real opportunity to be a part of that legislation, their attitude changes. And we just got to realize that's a reform. And I mean in the most sincere way, it's a reform that needs to happen. We can address the abuse, and we have to. We have to make sure it's transparent, and we have to make sure that it's all public. But there's nothing wrong with giving elected members an opportunity to direct policy and resources to important projects that they hold of high priority.
Tom, you know, that's something I agree with you on very much. And, you know, the select committee.
I have to say amen on that too. I really think they need to bring it back. I used it in a very helpful way in leadership, but also quite often departments like transportation, they're earmarking projects. And yet quite often I would know more about it where the road project was needed the most in Mississippi, much more than a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. Absolutely, Tom is right. We need to bring that back in a responsible way. It can be abused. So some reforms would be in order, but they need it.
So wholly in agreement. And I will just note that the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which did exceptional work, has decided that they should be thought of as community-based grants. So language matters, and I think there may be a reform there as well. So two more questions, and I know we have a hard stop at 3. First, again, for you, Tom, and it's a question about, I'll summarize the broader agenda. You know, sure, we have a pandemic, but what about immigration and climate change and the core issues that were important to the base that got President Biden elected, according to this questioner? What does a 50-50 Senate do to those issues?
Well, I think there's real potential for maybe I'm just too myopic, and I admit that there are times when I have been, but I have to say I think the potential exists for bipartisanship on immigration. Trent knows a ton about that. He had a long history with regard to efforts to deal with immigration in the past. I think if we look at economic recovery through infrastructure, and for that matter, if we look at climate issues through infrastructure, there's tremendous potential. I might note that some of the brightest red states have the greatest alternative energy infrastructure in the country today. So it's not necessarily at all a partisan issue. I think we've got to look at healthcare. We've got to deal with some of the major issues around the Affordable Care Act. The Supreme Court may dictate that we do that, but that has to be addressed. And then, of course, COVID and Iran, and just making sure that we get the vaccines out to those who need them the most, and in an orderly and completely successful logistical way is really critical as well. All those issues have enormous potential for bipartisanship today.
So last question for you, Senator Lott, and it's gonna bring back one of maybe not your happiest memories, but part of what changed the dynamic of the Senate was Senator Jim Jeffords, despite your many, many efforts with the singing senators and working his grandchildren to actually keep him in the fold, changing parties. And there is some discussion now. Senator Murkowski's been quite clear. Others have suggested that they feel so alienated from at least the kind of Trump version of the Republican Party, that they would consider possibly shifting their affiliation. Do you think that there's a serious possibility there? And should, is Senator Schumer thinking about that probably as he figures out how to proceed?
He may be thinking about it, but I don't think there's a serious possibility there. I will say this. I'll admit that one of the reasons I had the Singing Senators Quartet was to hold Jim Jeffords in close to me so I could know what he was thinking. And he loved to sing. Whether it was good or not is up for debate. But, I said at the beginning of the show, I hope that last Wednesday was not the day that the music stopped for America. We do need to think carefully about how we go forward. I think if we could sing together a little bit more, it would help. We even tried to make it a bipartisan group, Tom and I, and I think Barbara Boxer, we all sang together one night at one of the museums. But that's the kind of thing that creates camaraderie, just being together and enjoying each other's company. We used to have the spouses dinner, and I made it a particular point to have senators of opposing views like Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy sit next to each other. And we wrote odes to our wives, and it was a totally bipartisan thing. That kind of thing helps so much in creating the relationship that you need. If you had dinner with a senator one night with his wife, the odds are you're not going to be wanting to stick a knife in his back the next day. We need to think about that. I think Tom's idea about going up to Camp David or having regular meetings in the White House, having joint meetings of the senators. Used to, Tom and I talk about it, we'd go into our separate meeting places and we'd come out mad at each other. But if we got in the room together, the whole tone changed. So I hope that they can do that.
Thank you, Trent. So, Tom, a last word from you. You've been a founder of the BPC and a partner all these years. What's your aspiration for the next 18 months for the country?
Well, actually, I said earlier that the desecration of the Capitol was a metaphor for their political process. I think the same metaphor applies with the determination of the leaders to come back and keep governing in spite of that desecration. That's my closing view of the world today and of our country, is that I think there's hope here. If you haven't watched Arnold Schwarzenegger's video, let me put in a plug for Arnold right now. It went viral last night. It is so good, but he just captures, I think, what we as a nation have to be thinking right now. He was talking about how a sword gets stronger the more it's tempered. And, we've been tempered. And just like the sword that he used in Conan, he was talking about the importance of tempering that sword to make it stronger. Well, we're certainly tempered, and we can use that tempering process to make our Congress and our policy and our whole governmental capacity much stronger. And I'm hopeful that our leaders will rise to the occasion to make that happen.
Well, I think, the fact that we were invoking Conan the Barbarian as a symbol of possibility does show the challenges ahead. But again, it's just a real honor to have the opportunity to continue to work with you both. And I think you are both going to be in extremely high demand in public and private as the country tries to figure out how to move forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. And the Bipartisan Policy Center, keep up the good work.
Absolutely.
Take care, guys. Thank you.